Well, it's been months, and I'm finally here with part 3 of the 2021 update series. Why did it take so long? You can thank your friendly neighborhood Congress. After months of back and forth, the Senate landed on the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill. Now, I could do a whole video complaining about how this became this, and about my feelings on Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema.
Miss Sinema. No.
But that's really not the focus of this channel or this series, so suffice to say, bad things happened to this bill via the bipartisan process. Now, the reconciliation bill was supposed to make up for that, but while I was working on this video, it looked like a good reconciliation bill was on thin ice. However, the reconciliation bill actually just advanced in the Senate literally as I was finishing this video, and it survived relatively unscathed. So this all may work out okay in the end, but more on that at the end. Until then, let's focus on the bipartisan bill, which on its own is better than nothing, and when you combine it with the $100 billion California state budget surplus, we're looking at some exciting new funding opportunities. So what I'm going to do now is go through those funding mechanisms in both the federal bill and the state surplus plan that could apply to local projects, determine which projects could pull funding from where, opine on how I think it'll all shake out, and finish with a rundown of when projects are likely to open in the next decade based on the new information. Now, I've done the best I can here with interpreting everything in the bill, but I may have gotten some details wrong or misunderstood a few things, so please sound off below if there's any errors. Plus, some of these things could still change prior to implementation. So, let's start with the California state surplus. Out of the $11 billion in infrastructure spending, $1 billion is actually slated specifically for project acceleration for the Olympics in LA, which is fantastic. $4.2 billion is slated for California high-speed rail, although it seems like this doesn't actually represent a budget boost, but it's just meeting baseline spending. Another billion is slated for, quote, other priority transit and rail projects, $500 million is slated for high-priority grade separations and grade crossings, and another $500 million for zero-emission rail and transit equipment purchases. Note that I'm only pulling out funding that could go towards rail and transit, not roads or other infrastructure. This state surplus would theoretically pay out immediately, and it's worth noting that California could have future surpluses that could continue to provide this kind of funding. Now, let's look at the federal funding mechanisms. There's $550 billion of new spending in the bill. A paltry $39.2 billion of this is slated for transit, with $66 billion slated for passenger and freight rail, and $5 billion slated for a, quote, new National Infrastructure Project Grant Program that could conceivably be used to fund transit and rail infrastructure as well. It's also got a lot of small earmarks in it, which includes money for some stuff in LA. So let's look at that transit funding first. This is the most complicated one. Now, not all of this funding is for new transit. The part that is goes to the Capital Investments Grant Program. The CIG program is the major source of federal funding for transit projects currently, and the way it works is it gets around $3 billion a year to pay out to projects, and each project may get out of that, say, $100 million a year for 10 years. $8 billion has been added to the existing CIG funds to be paid out over 5 years, which means $1.6 billion per year. So for the next 5 years, instead of around $3 billion a year getting paid out in capital investment grants, there will be $4.6 billion. If this sounds like a pretty small increase, well, it is. It really is. There's also $19.15 billion that will go towards some of these future payouts should Congress fail to budget the necessary money in years down the road, but I'm not really considering this new money up for grabs. In addition to that, there's also $9.45 billion in what is known as formula funding for California transit, but it's not clear if this represents an increase over baseline levels, and if so, how much. And it appears either a large majority or the entirety of this money may be going to things other than capital projects. Passenger rail is a much bigger winner than transit. Out of the $66 billion, $30 billion is set aside for the Northeast, leaving $16 billion for the nationwide Amtrak network outside of the Northeast, of which it should be noted the Pacific Surfliner is the busiest remaining service. $5 billion set aside for rail safety improvements, and some sources say there's $12 billion for new non-Amtrak intercity rail, but I can't find that line item in some summaries of the bill, but I'll assume they're correct about that. So these are our funding programs. Now here's one very important note. In order to qualify for any of the federal money, projects need 3 things. They need to have some degree of local funding, meaning we can't just fund new projects wholly with federal money. They need to have undergone a National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA review, which many projects choose not to as it takes a while, and they need to score highly on factors like cost effectiveness and passengers served in order to beat out other projects. This actually means relatively few projects in LA could qualify for federal funding currently. Many projects have chosen not to pursue NEPA reviews, either because of the time it would take or because they know they'll score low and not be competitive, like the Foothill Gold Line Montclair extension, and other projects like the Vermont Subway or Arts District Station have no local funding to match at the moment, so they're not eligible for any federal funds. So let's make a grid. Here's all the projects in LA that could potentially vie for funds in the near future, and their current budget shortfalls. And here are our funding mechanisms. I've added public-private partnerships and enhanced infrastructure financing districts to the list. Please note that this is showing what funding a project is eligible for, not what it definitely will receive. Potentially means it's potentially eligible, and I'm not totally certain. Again, sound off if you have insight into any of the question marks, or if the details of anything are wrong. I've put the projects here in the order of most likely to be fully funded out of the combination of programs here, but please note, this now is my opinion. Let's go down the list. At the top, we have the West Santa Ana Branch Light Rail Corridor. Now, the environmental impact review was just released for this, and staff recommended the alignment from Slauson to Pioneer. Now, it's unclear if staff is recommending this entire alignment as the first phase, or to build the alignment from the C line to Pioneer as the first phase, and this as the second. They did not suggest which downtown alignment to take, punting that decision to the future, though the Metro Board may weigh in on that soon. I may actually do a whole video on this line at some point if I have the time, though that could be a few months. Suffice to say for now, though, that I feel pretty confident that the first phase of this will just be the bit from the C line to Pioneer, which has a mere $650 million shortfall compared to the $2.1 billion shortfall it would have if the first phase went to Slauson. Now, this entire bit could be taken care of with just a public-private partnership, which Metro had been pursuing, though we haven't heard much about that in a while, and I feel like the downtown phase would be required upfront for the public-private partnership to really make sense. Instead, I expect this to be a huge contender for that $1 billion in state Olympics money, as it's currently slated to open in 2032, and funding this now could very realistically get this section open by 2028. They're also toying with the idea of creating an EIFD to fund this, and it's also eligible for federal money, though I don't know how competitive just this section would be. If Phase 1 does wind up going all the way to Slauson, it could be far more competitive. Though I expect the open date in that case could get pushed back from the Olympics. Let's move down to the Sepulveda line. Now, we don't know yet what the budget shortfall will be because we don't know yet whether the Metro Board will choose heavy rail or monorail. Please see my previous video for my thoughts on that. Nor do we know, should they ultimately choose to enter a public-private partnership, what the funding split will be. My expectation here is that they will choose heavy rail. It's been pointed out to me by users on the Transit Coalition forums that the strategy by BYD, the monorail pushing entity, seems to have been to use their bait-and-switch numbers to secure a position as the only P3 to advance to the next stage, where they could then present themselves as the only remaining option if LA wants this built many years sooner than it otherwise would get built. Luckily, since that did not happen and the Metro Board advanced both BYD and Bechtel to the next stage, hope remains that the monorail's many flaws will lose out to heavy rail. Though we do all need to be very vocal about this so that corruption doesn't land us with the monorail anyway. All that said, I think this will be a heavy rail P3 with Bechtel, and I think the remaining funds will easily get paid up by federal CIG grants as they'll beat out basically any other project in the nation. I do not think this will get any state money, and especially not the Olympics money, as I do not think Phase 1 of this could actually open before 2030. Next, the Inglewood People Mover. There is massive political support behind the People Mover, and it has high relevance to the Olympics and is eligible for federal funds. I think a combination of the Olympics money and federal grants will easily fund this to open prior to the Olympics, with the possibility of an EIFD contributing as well. Next, to me, one of the most exciting things. So Amtrak wants $2 to $3 billion for the Pacific Surfliner to both electrify it to San Diego and to straighten the tracks, including building a tunnel to redirect it from a collapsing ocean bluff. This would reduce the travel time to San Diego from 3 hours all the way down to 2 hours. Now, I love the Surfliner, and I consider it a vastly better experience than driving, even at 3 hours. When it goes down to 2 hours, this train will be packed, and it will funnel a huge number of people into the metro to get to Union Station to take the train. And this seems almost guaranteed to get fully funded. The straightening can pull some money from that $5 billion rail safety fund because of the collapsing ocean bluff, and the rest can easily come out of the $16 billion national fund, especially since it's the busiest service eligible for that funding. I consider this some of the best news to come out of this bill. Next, California High-Speed Rail is almost guaranteed to get some money out of that apparent $12 billion new intercity rail pot, though I expect this to be put towards the section between the Central Valley and San Francisco. Now we move on to things I'm less sure of. The Centinela grade separation on the Crenshaw line, which I talked about in part 1 of the series, and which frankly should not be funded at all, is likely to get money from that state grade separation $500 million fund. The final 2 foothill extension stations to Montclair are also likely to get state money, either from the Olympics or General Fund, depending on how much money is left. These should truthfully be way further down the list, given the much lower need for them than other projects, but there is a strong political backing for them, and keeping this area happy was always key to passing the sales tax measures that fund much of the metro. Link Union Station's unfunded Phase B, which includes a new concourse, more run-through tracks, and other improvements, is eligible for federal funds after completing a NEPA review, and has a pretty good shot of getting some funding from all the various federal programs that apply. It's probably eligible for both CIG and passenger rail funding. I expect its full need can be met with new federal funding in the coming years. The Washington Flower grade separation desperately needs money, and it might get some of that out of the state grade separations fund, but overall it's going to be fighting with so many other projects. I'm just a little pessimistic that it's going to draw the full funding it needs out of all of these programs. That would change, I think, if it chose to undergo a NEPA review. The South Bay Green Line platform extensions, well, are confusing because 2 months ago it seems like some Measure M money might have been repurposed to cover this to be done by 2024, but if that's the case, it's not clear whether there's still a shortfall. If there's a large shortfall, the project's unlikely to get all the money it needs from all of these programs, because again, there just isn't enough state money to go around and federal funds can't be put towards this without a NEPA review. If it's a smaller shortfall, then yeah, the state money could probably cover it, and if there's no shortfall, then hey, it doesn't even belong on this list, and never mind. Helpful, I know. Metrolink wants to do a lot of work, including electrifying a portion of its network that's a backdoor California high-speed rail project, as those trains will use that track, but it also hasn't undergone a NEPA review. I think this could get some state money for electrification, and it could get a lot of money for new vehicles, but I think overall we're looking at a likely shortfall still. It's worth noting that if it did choose to undergo NEPA, I feel like it could be competitive. So for all of these yellow and orange projects, if that formula funding I mentioned earlier represents a significant increase over baseline funding, and if it's not all tied up for specific things that are not capital projects, and if that funding would not require full NEPA reviews, all extremely big ifs, then these may have a higher chance of finding full funding out of this bill. Finally, the projects that, in my opinion, probably won't be so lucky. The Green Line to Torrance and the East Side Gold Line are both 28 by 28 projects and considered, quote, pillar projects by Metro, but the Green Line to Torrance still has not chosen a route, and it will be less competitive for federal grants. And while I've seen one reference to a NEPA review potentially happening in the future, it doesn't seem like they're pursuing it now. That leaves state money, and it could get a bit of that Olympics fund, but I'd expect it to have dried up by the time we get this far down. I don't see much chance of this actually getting accelerated past the expected 2031 opening date. And time's definitely running out to get the East Side Gold Line done by 2028. It actually would be competitive for federal grants, but Metro decided to stop the NEPA process for the time being to, ironically, accelerate the review stage. Maybe a few years down the road, Metro will do a new NEPA analysis and apply for federal funds, but it's not going to happen anytime soon. Then we have the Arts District Station. It doesn't appear to be undergoing a NEPA review at this time, but if it were to in the future, it could be competitive for federal money as long as some local money is also secured. But I think it's far more likely that this will get full funding via state money in a future year, due to its costs being rather low. I do think this has a chance of getting done by the Olympics, actually. It could be built extremely quickly. I'm going to be a huge optimist on this and say it could open as early as 2026 with the second phase of the Purple Line. I think it could get funded in, say, 2023 or 2024, and then take 2 years to build and test. Okay, so these are all the projects in the pipeline that we could see funded or accelerated before that 5-year boost to CIG grants runs out. But what about after that? Well, if we imagine more state surpluses and better Congresses in the future, the next set of projects could get funding easily. And even if CIG grants revert back to their original levels, most of these projects I'm about to list would still be competitive. So in order of likelihood to get federal funding, assuming these undergo NEPA reviews, we've got Phase 2 of the Sepulveda line, obviously, which would go from the Expo line to LAX. Phase 2, maybe 3 depending on how phasing works out, of the West Santa Ana branch. The Vermont subway, which has no local funding out of Measure M and would potentially need an EIFD to get the necessary matching local funds. Crenshaw North, which could also be supplemented with an EIFD to speed things up. The East Side Gold Line, as previously mentioned, and the Orange Line conversion to light rail, which the Valley would certainly prefer to see happen sooner than its Measure M date. The necessary environmental reviews of these projects are mostly ongoing or about to start, with the exception of the Orange Line conversion. Metro just needs to add NEPA to some, which hopefully it will do now with the tantalizing prospect of more federal money down the line. So let's consider now the timeline of opening dates in the next decade. Here's the current system. Now, it keeps shifting back and forth between the regional connector and Crenshaw opening first, but at the moment it feels like the regional connector will lap the Crenshaw line and open in the third quarter of 2022, while the Crenshaw line north of Fairview, thanks Sentinel, great separation, will open in quarter 4. Quarter 3 of the next year could see the Crenshaw line opening except for the LAX station, along with the LAX 8PM without that connector station. These two lines will be joined by that connector station 1 year later in quarter 3 of 2024. At the end of that year, the first phase of the Purple Line will open. The second phase of the Purple Line will come at the beginning of 2026, along with the Orange Line grade separation improvements, which aren't indicated on the map. Later that year, we could have, in my optimistic opinion, the Arts District Station, followed by the North San Fernando Valley BRT line, if Metro doesn't cancel it, which they're toying with doing due to opposition. And then the NoHo Pasadena BRT line, although I would be unsurprised to see that delayed a little. 2027 will see the Foothill extension built to Pomona, the Inglewood People Mover potentially opening, and the final phase of the Purple Line extension opening. Now, in 2028, if the funds come through for acceleration, I would expect the Foothill extension to Montclair and the West Santa Ana branch phase 1 to the C line to open just before the Olympics, pushing them up from their current schedule times to 2029 and 2032 respectively. The first phase of the East San Fernando Valley Light Rail line is also supposed to open then, seemingly just after the Olympics, though I expect them to try to accelerate that timeline a few months because that just seems silly. Then I expect Sepulveda Phase 1 to open in 2030, followed by the Vermont BRT, and then the Green Line to Torrance in 2031. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, as I was finishing this video, some details about the reconciliation bill finally came out, and the bill advanced shortly thereafter. And contrary to my expectations, it seems like they actually are adding more transit funding. And I mean like, a lot of it. It seems like there might be 24 to 35 billion added for transportation spending beyond baselines and beyond what's in the bipartisan bill, and 60 billion added for discretionary spending by the House Transportation Committee, as well as programs in other areas that could conceivably be used to fund transportation as well. Now, details on this are few and far between, and things can still change throughout the reconciliation process, yada yada yada, but if this does pass, needless to say, this is a lot of money. It's anyone's guess right now how much of this will actually go towards capital projects, but I would expect the Metro to start furiously completing NEPA reviews on anything and everything in the next couple of years, assuming this new spending will require NEPA. I think basically everything on the grid could get some money here as long as it's eligible, and I think a few of those 6 follow-up projects could even snag some dollars if a significant amount of this money goes towards capital projects. Maybe after everything passes and Metro figures out what they're going to submit to what programs, I'll do another update video on this to give some more clarity. But for now, suffice to say, things aren't looking too shabby, and pretty soon they could look even better. Let's hope the reconciliation bill survives as is. Thanks for waiting so long for this video. When Metro finally finalizes their list of long-term strategic unfunded projects, which I'm hoping will be any day now, I'll make a video about the very long-term vision for the Metro network beyond what's funded, and my own take on what that network should look like. Depending on how crazy work gets, that could come in September, but we'll see. And then maybe in November or so, I'll do a video on the West Santa Ana branch line and the update we'll get on Crenshaw North. So, until next time, get vaccinated, mask up, stay safe, and go yell at Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema.